Well, good morning, Graham, and thank you very much for joining us to talk to the Mint magazine today.
Yes, good morning, Henry. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to have the opportunity to talk with you.
Well, that's brilliant. Well, I thought I'd start with the beginning of your book on how to think about climate change, which I thought started with a really intriguing story, arrival in California and meeting up first with conspiracy theories in the form of that David Bowie was really an alien and this was being hidden. But it raised obviously an intriguing question as to what isn't a conspiracy theory, because a lot of your book, obviously, the early sections are about you pinning on various powerful groups, if you like, the accusation for blocking action on climate change. And people might say, well, aren't they conspiracy theories? Can you tell us a bit about those groups and why you think these aren't conspiracy theories and actually, in a sense, true?
Yes, a good question, because I think I do allude to it myself near the beginning there and say, so how do I persuade you, the reader, that this isn't just another conspiracy theory? And I suppose the way I start is to try to make myself credible and show that I really don't have a stake in this issue, because I used to say to my students when I was teaching on climate change, I won't be here when the worst hits. You know, it's you that will take the brunt of it. I'm now beginning to think, actually, maybe I might still be here because it's starting already. But I think that the short way of putting it is that conspiracy theories are loony ideas based on flimsy evidence, whereas in my book, we hear the voice of sober reason based on years of research. That's the short answer. I think it's important, I think, to ask the how and the why of it. And let's take the example of, say, the conspiracy theorists who were saying global warming is a hoax. There aren't so many of them left, but the idea was that climate scientists are telling us about this because they get more grant money if they find dire consequences, or because they're being paid by the clean energy companies or something. And if you ask how that works, that one would have to falsify temperature records going back to the 19th century. And, there would have to be this vast global conspiracy with literally thousands of climate scientists all over the world who work together a lot to be in cahoots in some way to fool the public. And that how just isn't the answer to that how isn't very plausible. And if you ask, well, why? Well, because they want to make money. Well, okay, that's a motivation we can understand. But then there have to be easier ways of making money than to have a global conspiracy among climate scientists. So I would say with the how of, let's take the Koch brothers for example. They're my main target. So how do these groups operate? They infiltrate universities. They fund university positions so that the big ideas can get gestated. They found think tanks like the Institute of Economic Affairs, was one of the first ones in Britain, which is still going strong, I see. Yeah. And then they found these grassroots or AstroTurf organizations that are people's engagement with these ideas. And so you can see the pattern. You can see, they among themselves are quite clear what they're doing. This is a grand strategy. And so I think that I can lay out the how. I think I do lay out the how in a fairly convincing narrative that is grounded in, I've got lots of footnotes. There are appendixes on the web where there's even more information than most people would want. And then if we ask the why, that for me is the interesting question, because I think, again, you see a pattern that people are in polluting industries and they run afoul of government regulation because they are harming people or the neighbors to their factories, or they're harming the environment. And they have to pay fines, and they figure often it's easier just to pay the fines and keep the cash rolling in. But I think you can see the Koch brothers deciding fairly early on, rather than keeping on because they had to pay massive, record-breaking fines, why don't we change the government? Why don't we change the rules when we get in there? And I think you can see that's precisely what happened. It became most obvious with the Trump administration, where the freedom partners, these donors, connected with the Kochs, that whole seminar network they call it, they gave a laundry list to the Trump administration and say, these are the things that we want you to do. And then a year later, I quote actually you can find it on the web. They have this triumphant memo goes around saying it's a checklist. Look what they did. They did all these things, including pulling the US out of the Paris climate agreement.
Yeah.
So I think that, I hope that I lay all that out in a convincing way, and that people realize, certainly my students, when I used to teach it, my students said, my God, we never realized this was going on. And I didn't either until I...
Still, you look at it is eye-opening, isn't it? And it makes you wonder about these people. I mean, you set out early on that you don't want to be moral, but you say, there's a basic sort of well-established moral principle, and a moral principle that sort of do unto others as you would be done to, sort of thing. And obviously, these people, these powerful people, such as the Koch brothers, but others, and people who are powerful in fossil fuel industry more broadly, don't seem to be following this very basic human principle. Are they evil?
Okay, that's a big question. Yes, let me just explain why I steer clear of ethics, because there's a big field in philosophy, environmental ethics, and people think I do that, but I don't do that. I call it environmental philosophy. And two reasons I don't do it. One is it's very easy to become you must have come across preachy environmentalist.
Yes, yeah.
If I say to myself, I'm going to steer clear of the ethical questions, then I'm less likely to come off as preaching. And secondly, because this is a global problem, the climate crisis is global, and I think we're going to be able to talk to the Chinese and to the Indians and to the Brazilians a lot more effectively if we steer clear of ethical language, because they that's set up differently in different cultures and in different languages, and especially with the Chinese. What's interesting is, I think I say at one point that, of course, there is a sort of minimal ethical principle, and you just mentioned it, do unto others, or the Confucians do it, they have the negative formulation, don't impose on other people what you yourself don't want, which is a nice way of looking at the same issue, really, but from a different perspective. And if we're honest with ourselves, we do that a lot. Impose on other people. Easier for me to get the other person to shape up rather than for me to do it myself. So that's why I try to avoid ethical discourse, except when it comes down to really that basic, the golden rule. I mean, you find it in almost every culture and in every ethic, some version of that, of fairness, of basic fairness or justice. And in the case of the polluting factories, the question would be to the factory owner who just dumps the toxins into the local water supply. Well, how would it be if your neighbor did that over the fence of your vast country mansion?
Yes. Space to put.
And so it's something that when you say, well, let's reverse the situation, most people would see, okay, I get the picture. So instead of that, the question I urge my students to think about is, we can just say, instead of is this right or wrong morally, we can just ask ourselves, is this the kind of society we want to have, or is this the way we want things to be in our society? Is this how we want to interact with each other? And if it isn't, then there are various ways of getting there. We can talk to each other, we can have dialogue, or we can have laws and regulations that say, no, there are certain things that are out of bounds. So yes, I don't use the category of evil very often, I have to say, but I mean, sometimes I have to say to myself, yes, I think these people are so pathologically selfish and self-centered that they hardly know that they're hardly aware of other people existing at all. And when that individualism gets to that extreme sense that really there's a total lack of consideration for others or for the effects of my action, then I would say, yeah, I suppose I would say, rather than evil, I would say pathological narcissism, perhaps, would be my diagnosis.
I mean, some people also say that people get stuck in systems, I suppose, leaving aside the Koch brothers, who are maybe extreme, but say the chief executive of Exxon or of Shell or whatever, who have a huge sets of pressures on them, and I suppose have got to the position they're in through following the rules of the organization they're in. So they're not, I mean, I wonder about them. Are they also trapped in some sense, rather than being narcissistic or whatever you want to, pathologically selfish?
Yes, right. I suppose that's true of quite a lot of people. And I think what your question highlights is really the nature of the corporation, because the CEO can say, look, my duty, it says so in the rules here, is to maximize profits for my shareholders. And if that's all that's in the rule book or the mission statement of the company, then I think we have a problem, because it's one of the big problems of capitalism that it's easy to externalize a lot of the costs of doing business, which is precisely what we're talking about with CO2 emissions. And I see that there is a movement to now make corporations, if they're legally persons, which is a strange idea, but apparently true, can't we make them socially more conscious persons? Can't the corporation have some responsibilities, not just to its shareholders, but to its neighbors, literally the people next to its factories, or to the rest of us? So that's I think that if we were to change that, it would be easier to be a CEO and sleep at night.
And I suppose there's wider culture as well. I mean, we have, in this same issue that your interview will be, we have someone writing about denial, and who suggested actually that it was counterproductive to attack or demonize oil companies, because actually we have benefited. They have created a lot of benefits. The people involved in them have been told a narrative or a story of what it is to be good. So in a sense, their own values, identity are all bound up with a certain way of living and being. So, and if you start labeling them in some way as bad people, they will become more defensive and more stuck, that you remove the potential for a bridge or a path to a different space.
Right. No, I think that's a good point. Maybe I should cool my jets a bit.
It's very difficult when you see the Koch brothers. I mean, when I read Dark Money, I was amazed. And if you didn't know that this was written by, I mean, you've got to sort of rely on that it's written by a reputable journalist, you'd think, God, you couldn't make it up. I mean, because it is extraordinary. I wanted to move on to the sort of core of your book, which is more I suppose, the philosophical kernel, I would say. And what struck me first was, I mean, I studied philosophy in the early 1980s in England, and philosophy was not like the philosophy we studied was nothing like the sort of philosophical discussions that you had. It was analytical, so-called Western analytical philosophy, and it wasn't about what is a good life or how to have self-constraint or be linked to the environment. It was about theory of knowledge, lots of sort of complex argumentation. I know I had a friend who also started in philosophy, and she was deeply disillusioned because she thought she was going to get the sort of discussion that you provided in the book. Do you think Western or Anglo-Saxon maybe philosophy at the broadest level has taken a wrong path over the last centuries in terms of moving into this highly analytical and sort of theoretical space that it's tended to populate? And is that part of the problem and the source of the extreme libertarianism that's come out as well?
Yes, I think it is. If I may slip in a short anecdote about my undergraduate experience, I went on a scholarship to Oxford in modern languages, but I wanted to change to philosophy because I discovered Nietzsche. And so at the interview, they had three people in French and German, and then there was a philosopher who didn't say anything. And at the end, he said, "Oh, Mr. Parks, we understand you want to change to philosophy. Why is that exactly?" And I said, because philosophy is about the meaning of it all. That's what I'm concerned with. And he burst out laughing and he said, "Good God," he said, "I don't think you'll find anyone here interested in that question."
Yes.
And he was more or less right, unfortunately, because it was mostly analytic philosophy of language. Yes, I mean, I think there are two ways, if we step back from this, there are two ways really of doing philosophy. And one is as a theoretical exercise. And you think about things and you think at meta levels and meta levels, so on. Or there's also philosophy as a way of life. And there's a wonderful book by Pierre Hadot on showing that if you go back to Socrates, we have that in our tradition, that Socrates was concerned with finding the right way to live. And he often said, "Don't listen to what I say, look at how I live, look at my actions, look at what I do." And that says a lot to me. I mean, I think that distinction of two basic ways of doing philosophy is valid. And I think that what happened in the West is that we had a change, a turn away from philosophy as a way of life to philosophy as theoretical activity. There was a sort of ascent to the theoretical level, and we tended to get stuck there. And it gave us all kinds of wonderful things like science, the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment, and technology, and so on. But yes, I think we then lost the path in a way, which leads through people like Montaigne and Emerson and Thoreau and Nietzsche and so on. So it got marginalized. Philosophy as a way of life got marginalized. But if you look at the Chinese tradition, they never got to the theory part. They just said we're looking for the way, the Tao, the way to live, the way things work, and therefore the way to live as humans. And that informed the whole tradition. They were relatively uninterested in merely theoretical speculation. And so now, yeah, we can do environmental ethics or the ethics of the climate crisis or whatever. But it seems to me we have a situation where the world is not going very well, and that the kind of philosophical ideas we would benefit from, or to put it another way, in the debate about the climate, there's very often an unstated premise, or there's something in the background that nobody really brings up, which is, what do we think the good life is? I mean, what does it mean to live a fulfilled life? Because we're arguing from very different positions on that. And so that was the question I wanted to bring to the fore and say, yeah, that's really this is what would be most fruitful to think about. This would be the way to think about the climate crisis.
Is this sort of topic coming back into favor in the Western or Anglo-Saxon philosophical tradition, or are you an outlier on this?
I think I've always been an outlier, and I don't see me being asked to come back towards the center anymore. I think it is coming back a bit. I think one factor is that comparative philosophy with Asian traditions, say, or intercultural philosophy with Latin American traditions, or whatever you call it. There are various kinds of philosophy, that groups of philosophers, I should say, who say, look, the idea that philosophy is essentially Greek and then German and then now English and American with the analytic philosophy is a very parochial notion of what philosophy is, because other people have done it, other cultures have it, and not everyone agrees with that. But I've been studying those cultures, those traditions for a long time, and I'm convinced there's philosophy that's every bit as profound as ours in the Indian and Chinese and many other traditions. And I think that's beginning to open people up, because those philosophies are philosophies as a way of life, and that young people today are seeing, well, the world isn't in great shape. Why don't we have philosophers talking about these problems more concretely and directly and offering possible solutions to them?
But as you admit, holding the Chinese up as an example of the right way of living is a tough sell, given Hong Kong and so on, and I suppose the narrative that people read generally in papers. And one of the things that you say is that you accept that maybe due to the pursuit of power and money, the true way, the two traditional ethics of Chinese society, even though President espouses them, are not really followed. So that sort of, for me, slightly begs the question of, well, how powerful are these ethics or ideas? If you know, in the background, you can say that you can go to written sources in China and see them, but then you look at actually what is being done. I suppose in Socrates' terms, look at what you do, doesn't come out with a good result. So portraying China as a potential example or model is quite a hard sell.
Yes, right. And so two things. One is that the move to Chinese ideas that I recommend, that we entertain them, that we look at them and I think try to appreciate them, is a strategic one in a way, because I think we have to have a very robust dialogue with China on the climate crisis, or we burn the planet. I mean, it's that serious. If we can't,
we have no choice basically but to engage.
Yeah. Right. Now, rather than say, and so what I'm saying is, we can respect or show respect for the ideas in their tradition, because this is one of the reasons the Chinese are so prickly. They think that we diss their whole tradition, or that we don't know anything about Chinese civilization. And so I want to say, if we look at that and we look at the tradition of Chinese philosophy, we see some very interesting ideas, and some ideas that are very pertinent to our current climate predicament. And we can show respect for those ideas without showing respect for the Chinese Communist Party, which has espoused those ideas publicly. And Xi Jinping quotes from the Confucian and Taoist classics. But the follow-up, the walking of the walk in that sense, is pretty meager. And so I agree with you, but if we keep the focus on the ideas, then another interesting thing happens, because when we see these Confucian and Taoist ideas that are different from mainstream Western, especially the sort of post-scientific revolution ideas, we see that actually we have counterparts to those ideas in our own tradition, in Plato to some extent, in the Stoics, in the Epicureans. But these, again, are those marginalized figures and schools of philosophy. Philosophy is a way of life. And that's why, and I think, and what I'm trying to say is that on the basis of that, these shared ideas, I mean, ideas that are really basically quite similar, we can have a conversation with a civilization and a culture as different in many ways as China is from ours, if we just do a little homework and inform ourselves a little, and not continue. Because when we continue to say to the Chinese, we had the scientific revolution, you didn't. We had the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which gave us reason and allowed us to reach truth. You didn't have that. Therefore, we talk on our terms and in our concepts. They see that as just more Western imperialism, forcing our way of conceiving the world and our way of talking onto them. Whereas I'm trying to say, can we not find some common ground for this dialogue, where we show that we understand something about their culture too?
Ironically, there are parts of the environment movement that have picked up positives from some elements of China, isn't it? I was at a speech by, I think it was the Director General of the Club of Rome a few years ago, and I was astounded, actually. Basically, he said, well, if only we were like China and could impose targets and control, then we'd be able to address climate change. And others have picked up on those themes, that we should desert democracy and pick up on central authoritarian control.
Yes, I mean, there is something to that, unfortunately. I mean, I hope we're not going to continue to press democracy on them, because it's not, the last couple of years have not been good years for democracy when you look at our leaders these days. But you have to say there are, again, I think it's both sides could learn from the other in this way, that if we look at how their system is run, it's to some extent really a meritocracy. You know, they have these public service examinations that they interrupted them for a while, but they've been going for 2,000 years. I mean, that was what, you know, they ran the empire through these, and they still have them, which means that the technocrats in the Politburo, in the Communist Party, there's no climate deniers there. They know stuff. They understand. They have not only been educated to be political leaders, but they've also had experience. They work their way up, you know, through the bureaucracy at different levels and in different places. And when you look at the Trump phenomenon, for example, here's someone who doesn't know anything and has no experience in being a politician. And if that's what you can get from a democracy, there must be something wrong with it. So that's something I think we can learn. They could learn from us something about checks and balances. I think that's one of the great things about democracy. And it used to be you had the emperor and then you had the literati, the intellectual class, who would say, oh, wait a minute, very tactfully, I don't know that we should do that. But they lacked that now in China, unfortunately. And it would certainly improve things, I think, if there was some counterbalance within the system where you could have internal criticism of it.
And I suppose if they felt more self-confident in their fundamental ideas and less continuously on the defensive, they may be more open, possibly.
Yes, I think so. And I think the other thing I meant to say was that, of course, our Western ideas of we're separate from nature, we're superior to it, we're individuals, we're independents, and so on, all the ideas that I think aren't very helpful because they got us into the climate crisis. Of course, they spread around the world in the 19th century, and Japan in particular realized if we don't modernize, we're going to be colonized. It was a very clear choice. And so when people say, but look at the environment in China, they completely destroyed their environment. Well, yes, but that was under the influence of Western ideas. You know, they went gung-ho on those. And so they were forgetting their own tradition in that during that period.
So just finally, I thought this was a fascinating discussion of these different ideas and how we could introduce different, rediscover history of ideas and also learn from China. But what, apart from actually learning about these things and being more knowledgeable, how do you think that might affect what we do in terms of, say, protest or demonstrating different ways of living or you know, in terms of the environment movement? I'm sort of struck by how XR has introduced a new language, almost a new way of dressing, a new way of being. I don't know if that gels at all with your ideas, but is this the sort of direction that you think the environment movement should go in to reflect, to bring this sort of philosophical, ethical dimension into its being?
Yes, I think it would be helpful because maybe I don't make it sufficiently explicit in the book, but the idea, you know, this war of ideas that I was so interested to discover is taking place, and Jane Mayer's book is very good on that. She really points out how that's their language, that's what they've been doing, and we don't seem to have cared very much. And I'm thinking, if they've been waging a war of ideas to push the libertarian agenda, who's pushing back? And don't philosophers deal with ideas? Do we not need some pushback from people like me? And that's, I think, what I wanted to leave people with, because it is to say, I mean, the book is called How to Think rather than What to Think about the Climate Crisis. And so I lay out the libertarian hyper-individualist notion of we are separate, autonomous individuals, independent, you know, of almost everything, and we're in competition. There's a neo-Darwinist idea.
But what sort of interests me is, in a way, your ideas are about how to be, aren't they? And that you're saying that ideas should be about how you're being. So I was thinking, almost actually, you could retitle your book "How to Be" about your. But I was thinking, you know, being is about obviously acting and demonstrating or behaving, or a set of rules for etiquette and interactions and so on. And it sort of struck me that the direction of your philosophical ideas sort of suggested there was a practical implementation, how you act. And so that getting the environment movement to integrate that dimension into what they do, if you like, seemed to be an implication.
Yes, because if you how you act, if you buy into the, let's call it the Western individualist notion of the autonomous person, is you do act selfishly, and it's only when you're sort of called upon to do so that you say, how would it look like from the other person's perspective, or what would considerateness be in this instance? The alternative is the notion of we are embedded in a world of interconnections and interactions. It, to a large extent, defines us. I mean, that's who we are. And this is very much the Chinese idea, but you do have it in the West tradition as well. And therefore, we're anything but independent. We are interdependent, both with other people and very obviously with the world of nature, the resource base, as it were, on which we depend. And so, yes, there's along with philosophy as a way of life, there's the idea of experimental philosophy that comes from Montaigne and then Emerson, where you say, these ideas, I'm not claiming a truth value from them. I'm just saying they could work for you. So experiment with them, try them out in your own experience and see. And so that's in a way what I want to invite the reader to do, is to say, look at it this other way, or see, choose whether these are two diametrically opposed understandings of who we are as human beings, and therefore of what it means to be a good human being or to lead a fulfilled human life. I know which one I would opt for.
Yeah.
More sense, and it's probably comes through in the book. But I'm sort of inviting the reader to try these out and see. And if some people say, no, I prefer to be a libertarian, well, that's fine.
Okay, well, that's a good point, I think, to end. And I really hope people will look at your book, because, as you say, I think fundamentally we have to understand China. We have to work with China. And if you find the good in people, as Nelson Mandela suggested, then they will behave better.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Graham.
No, thank you. Bye-bye.